Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for RedGiantTV.com. And today, we're gonna get schooled in motion graphics, yo. Aw, yeah. In this episode of Red Giant TV, Carl Larsen is coming to town, and he's going to show us how to create this awesome animation using Trapcode form and Red Giant plane space in Adobe After Effects. Pretty cool, and this knowledge can all be yours for the low price of nothing. Not bad, right? Carl is the owner and lead technical creative of the St. Cloud, Minnesota-based Telescope Media Group, a company that runs the full gamut of services including pre-production, shooting, editing, animation, visual effects, and live events. Carl has also co-hosted the Creative Cow After Effects podcast since last November, providing a ton of great insight into motion graphics, expressions, 3D animation, and better workflows. He is a man of many talents and facades. Oh, and he's also a big lover of keyboard shortcuts, so even if you don't ever recreate any of what you see here, you're going to learn a lot of ways to speed up your work in After Effects in general. Oh, and before we get started, I'll just mention that if you want to follow along, you can download a trial version of both Plane Space and Form from the download sections at the Red Giant Software website, which you can find at www.redgiantsoftware.com. Okay, preamble over. Take it away, Carl.
Thanks, Aaron. So since you've already seen the preview, let's dive into it. So the first thing we'll need to do is create a comp with Trapcode form applied to a solid. So go to Composition, New Composition. Name it Form Comp, and set the duration to 8 seconds. I'm going to work in 720p at 24 frames per second, but you can do whatever you'd like. Just note, if you choose a different size or frame rate, some of the steps I'll be doing later on won't line up exactly with your project, and you may have to adjust accordingly. Next, I'll create a new solid, Layer, New, Solid, make it comp size, and call it Form. Then we'll apply Form to the layer by going to Effect, Trapcode, Form. Also create a camera so we can see what's going on with our object. That's Shift, Option, Command, C, or Layer, New, Camera. Choose 35mm and click OK. Alright, now if I press C on the keyboard to access my camera navigation tools, you can see that Form has generated an array of particles, and we've got 3 planes distributed in Z space, each of which contains 70 particles on the X and Y axis respectively. So if we select the Form layer, press F3 to access the Effect Controls palette, and twirl open the base form settings, you can see that's exactly what we have going on. Our base form is 200 by 200 by 200 pixels, and we're filling that with 70 particles on the X, 70 particles on the Y, and 3 particles in the Z. So for our project, I want to create a cube of cube-shaped particles, and push them around in space using a variety of layer maps. At the end, we'll have them come together to form one object and do a quick title build. That means in 720p resolution, I'll start with a base form of 400 by 400 by 400 and put 10 particles on each axis for a total of 1,000 particles in our system. Now pressing C on the keyboard until we activate the camera orbit tool, we can see we have a nice array of particles distributed as a cube in 3D space. Cool. So at this point, I'm going to right click on the camera in the timeline and choose Transform Reset to put the camera back where it began, and start working on our custom cube-shaped particle. We'll get back to how we're going to control the distribution of our particles in a little bit. So to create our custom particle, I'll create a new comp, name it Cube Particle, and make it 200 by 200 pixels, and click OK. Next, I'll add a new solid to the comp, Layer, New Solid, or Command Y, name it Cube Face, make sure it's composition sized, and choose a light gray color. Down in the timeline, I'll click on the cube icon to promote the layer to 3D, and then duplicate the layer 5 times, that's Edit Duplicate or Command D, so that I have a total of 6 cube faces. Now at this point, we'll want to distribute our layers into a shape of an actual 3D cube, which means we'll need to reposition and reorient our layers in 3D space to make that happen. So while it's possible to do this manually, I'm not going to make you do any math or drag you through the process of doing so. Instead, I'm going to use one of Red Giant's 3D plane space assistants to help speed up the process. So selecting all the layers, go to Window and choose Box Creator. We want our box to be created at the center of the world, so we'll leave the starting values at 0, 0, 0, and we want the dimensions of our box to match the size of our layers. So let's click on Fit Box to Layers to make that happen. So working through the rest of the window, we want 1 layer per side, a full cube with all faces active, and at this point we can go ahead and click Apply. So with that, we've created a cube and will no longer be needing the Box Creator window. So we'll close the window and add a camera to get a better idea of what's going on. Go to Layer, New Camera, or Command-Option-Shift-C as we covered earlier, and in this case, let's choose a really long focal length, like 200 millimeters. Choosing a long focal length will place the camera far away from our object with a narrow field of view, which will give us parallel lines on the vertical and horizontal lines of our cube. If we chose a short focal length, we'd get more distortion and it just wouldn't look quite right. So now with the camera selected, press P on the keyboard to reveal its position property, and scrub the Z value back until the entire cube is in the composition window. I'm repositioning the camera this way using the position property instead of the camera tools because this will leave the camera's point of interest at the center of the cube and make it easier for me to orbit around it in a little bit. Pressing C on the keyboard until we get the camera orbit tool, let's now orbit around the cube so its edges and top are facing the camera. And we can turn on the rulers in the comp, Command R, and drag a ruler out to 100 pixels to make sure that we have the cube rotated exactly 45 degrees off axis. So let's add a light to our comp to get some shading to our object. That's Layer, New Light, or Shift-Option-Command-L. Choose a point light and click OK. Now, with the light selected, I can move it into position and quickly get the lighting to make the cube appear much more dimensional. I'll add in a second point light and drag it in the opposite position to get some fill light on the cube as well. Okay, that looks good. Now the cube particle comp is ready to use. So now back in the form comp, let's drag our cube particle into the timeline, turn off its visibility, and use it as a custom particle. So select the form layer, press F3 to bring up the Effect Controls palette, and in the Particles section, choose Custom Colorize. Under the Custom Twirl Down, choose the cube particle as a source layer, and since this doesn't animate, we can leave time left at current time. Next, let's turn up the particle size to 25 and change composite mode from Add to Normal. Now pressing C on the keyboard so we can orbit again, we're starting to get something that looks pretty cool. So just to be clear, here's what's going on in form. We're using a pre-comped 3D cube with real 3D geometry as a basis of our 2D particle in form, which means as far as form is concerned, it's displaying a flat 2D object, which just happens to look like a 3D cube in our case, and it's arranging it in a 3D volumetric array, continuously orienting the particle face to the camera at all times. This is exactly the same custom particle behavior that we became familiar with in particular 1.5 and below. And we're going to exploit this display characteristic to make our flat particles look as though they really have 3D volume. So one of the first things we can do to make this look more convincing is to rotate our array. And normally we'd do this by adding a null to the center of the composition and parent the camera to it while spinning the null. However, we're going to take a simpler approach to this by once again right-clicking on the camera to reset its transformations, and instead animating the transform world properties of form itself. So navigate into the transform world section of the form plugin to where it'll open its properties and set the Y rotation to 45 degrees, and the X rotation until our array lines up with the perspective of the particle pre-comp, something around 20 degrees. And now that we've got things lined up, we can write a quick expression for the Y rotation so that it'll spin indefinitely. So option clicking on the stopwatch for the Y rotation of the transform world properties in form, let's write the following expression. Time times 48. This means that for every second of time, the array will spin 48 degrees. And I chose 48 simply because it's divisible by my frame rate of 24. But it doesn't have to be. Let's make a quick RAM preview just to make sure everything's spinning and looking good. And it is. Great. Now here's where we can start having some fun with our particles. First, let's change the particle's color. There's two ways to do this in form. First with a quick map, which can't be animated over time, but doesn't require any external inputs. Or secondly with a layer map, which can be animated over time, but has to be created as another composition or imported into the scene. So quick maps, as the name suggests, are very quick to set up. Simply choose a gradient or customize your own, and then tell form over which dimensions you'd like to apply the map. X, Y, Z, or radial. So I'm going to change that back to off and use a layer map instead, because in our case I want to set the color of our particles based on how my layer map changes over time. So let's create the color map. Create a new composition, name it color map, and make it the same size as your base form. And click OK. Next we'll create a new solid and apply effect, noise, fractal noise to get some cycling grayscale values. The easiest way to quickly animate motion with fractal noise is to add an expression to the evolution property. So just like we did with the transform world values, option click on the evolution stopwatch and type time times 48 in the expression field. Now we've got some cycling grayscale values. To turn the grayscale values into color, go to Effect, Color Correction, Colorama, and choose an output cycle that works well for you. Personally, I've always liked Fire and Smoke preset, but you go ahead and choose whatever childhood favorite is yours. And just to get a little more punch in the image, I'm going to turn up the contrast on the fractal noise to around 260 and then call it good. Okay, flipping back into the form comp, we can now bring in the color map we just created as a layer map for our particles. So drop it on the comp and turn off its visibility. So with the form layer selected, let's close down the Quick Map section and go to Layer Maps, Color and Alpha, and choose the Color Map comp for the source layer. We'll map the RGB values of the color map to the RGB values of the particle array by choosing RGB to RGB, and map the values over XY and time equals Z. If we chose another mapping method which doesn't include time, we'd end up with an edge of our cube that looked all the same. So having a changing color values mapped over XY and across time gives us a unique color for each particle on every side of the array. And the cool thing about this is that each average value in the color map layer gets assigned to the specific particle in the array, which means that each particle gets assigned one specific color value without having to add a mosaic filter to the map to make this happen. If we wanted to see more of the details in the color map, then we'd add more particles and make them smaller. Alright, we're getting somewhere. Next, let's create a grayscale map to reveal the particles at the beginning of the animation. So create another 400 by 400 composition, name it Size Map, and click OK. With nothing selected in the timeline, single click on the Mask tool and make sure the pull down is set to Rectangle Mask. Next, click on the Fill options and set the Fill to a linear gradient. Now we can do the same with the Stroke options and set it to none. Now double click on the Layer Mask tool to create a comp size shape layer with a linear gradient fill. Now grabbing the handles in the viewer, we can animate the position of the gradient over time to reveal the particles in form. So black values will make the particles disappear with the size of 0, and white values will allow the particles to be their maximum size as specified in the particle size section of form. Okay, so at the beginning of the timeline we'll put both control points outside of the layer boundaries and make sure the entire frame is black. So twirling open the shape layer in the timeline, opening Contents, Gradient Fill 1, let's set a keyframe for the start and end point of the gradient. Now let's go about 2 seconds down the timeline and move the gradient across the layer to the upper right hand corner until everything is white. Finally, set a keyframe in the middle by expanding the gradient all the way across the frame so we get a nice wide transition. Okay, great. We now have a feathered linear wipe going across the comp, something we could have done with the transition effect. But because we did this with the shape layer, we can go in now and edit our gradient as much as we'd like. So now we can add in a couple more points and adjust their positions so that we have a wave coming across the screen that'll make the size of the particles pulse as they come on, versus simply scaling up into position. You could get a ramp like this playing with Colorama too, but I'm just showing you another way to do it. Scrub through it to check it out, and looks good. Now back in the main comp, let's add the size map to our composition and turn its visibility off. Next, select the form layer, press F3 to bring up its Effect Controls palette, and navigate to the Layer Map section. Under the Size heading, assign the Size Map comp to the input layer and map the layer across XY. A quick RAM preview has the colored particles growing on screen, just like we were expecting. Alright, good. At this point, I've already worked out some of the numbers that I think look good. But the whole point of doing these tutorials is to get you playing with the software, so by no means do you have to follow this to the letter, but here's what I'm going to do. Starting at 1 second, I'm going to set a keyframe for size X, size Y, size Z, particle size, and fractal field effect size. In the timeline, let's select the form layer and press U to reveal the keyframe properties. Moving 10 frames down the timeline, I'll change size X to 1000, size Y to 50, and size Z to 1000. We're basically creating a larger flat box of particles. Now I'll change effect size to 250, and then scrub down the particle size to 2. Now I've got a whole bunch of randomly sized particles in my box. So I'll let the array stay like that for 20 more frames, and then set keyframes for all of the animated values, plus I'll add in a keyframe for flow evolution at this point. Flow evolution influences the particles that have been affected by fractal field controls, and so as we make our first set of changes, I want all of the particles to stay the same state, regardless of how they rotate in front of us. Pressing U twice to reveal the flow animation keyframe I just set, let's now move another 10 frames down the timeline and change the values again. Size X to 200, size Y to 200, size Z to 200. We'll take effect size down to 50, take flow evolution down to 0, and change the particle size to 1. Okay, so now we've got a smaller 3D cube affected by Perlin noise. We'll let that spin for 20 more frames and again set a new stack of keyframes. This time, I'll leave the base form at its current size but set the keyframe for particle size, effect size, and then add 2 more variables: spherical field strength and spherical field radius. Pressing U to reveal all keyframe parameters, I'll go down the timeline 10 more frames and change the spherical field strength to 100 and the radius to 250. As you'd expect, the particles move out in a spherical pattern as driven by the field. Let's change effect size to 0 and make the particles larger. Move 20 frames down the timeline again, and finally we want the particles to shrink back into one central point and disappear as we bring on the cube for the type reveal. So set a keyframe for X size, Y size, Z size, particle size, spherical strength, and spherical radius. Then move 10 frames down the timeline. We'll change each of the base form dimensions to 50, change the spherical field radius to 60, and make the strength 0. Finally, we'll set the particle size to 0 to make all the particles disappear. I want to keep things moving along, but with all those changes, we're definitely worth a quick RAM preview at this point. And there we go. Things are starting to look very, very cool. Okay, now for the title build. So the first thing we need to do is copy the cube particle. So back in the project window, select the cube particle pre-comp and duplicate it. Command D, then press return to rename it Logo Cube. This way we don't end up messing with our form particle by accident. Drag the Logo Cube into the form comp and place it below the form layer. The first thing we'll want to do is to get it expanded back out into 3 dimensions. So click on the 3D switch for the layer, and then the Collapse Transformation switch to get the comp to recognize the 3D layer space for the pre-comp. Now, pressing R on the layer to reveal its rotation properties, let's spin the cube around again and get its edges orientated to the camera again. So 20 on the X and 45 on the Y. So that looks good, but our cube looks flat since there aren't any lights in the comp. So let's add in some point lights and move each one off to the side to light the logo cube similar to what we did in the pre-comp. So I'll add one light, move it to the side here, and another, and move it off the other way. Next, we want to colorize the cube to make it a dark red color. So go to Effect, Color Correction, Tritone. We can set each of the values to a variant of red. So selecting the midtones, I'll select a mid-dark red value. In the highlights, I'll choose a lighter red value to get rid of the pinkish tones. And in the shadows, I'll choose a real dark red. Okay. For the actual title build, we want the logo cube to scale up as the form particles are scaling down. So when the particles are gone, we want the cube to be at 50% scale. So press S on the keyboard to reveal its scale and set the value to 50. And then moving back in time where the particles are fully expanded, we'll set the cube scale value to 0. Okay, now after the cube scales up, we'll want it to move immediately to the left and make room for the titles. So pressing Option P to set a position keyframe and Option R to set a rotation keyframe, move 10 frames down the timeline, that's Shift page down, and move the cube to 500 on X. And to make it spin into position, change the Y rotation of the cube to 130. I'll just go in here and delete the orientation, X rotation, and Z rotation keyframes that were automatically generated because we're not going to animate those properties. Now we'll add in our text layers. Shift, Option, Command T, or using the text tool, type Creative. And then duplicate the layer, Command D, and edit the text to say block. Move them into rough position, and let's set up the text. On the Creative layer, I'm going to use Times New Roman Italic at 80 pixels in black, which makes the layer go away. So let's change the background color of the comp, Shift Command B, or Composition, Background Color, and choose a light gray. Now on the block layer, let's set the type style to regular and the size to 55. Then move both layers into position. Now place both layers below the logo cube layer in the timeline. Timing-wise, we want the creative layer to appear first. Move 10 frames down the timeline and set a position keyframe for creative. That's Option P, or by pressing P on the keyboard and clicking the stopwatch. Now move 10 frames up the timeline and reposition creative so that it appears from behind the cube. Since the cube doesn't cover the whole layer, we'll use a mask to conceal the rest. Pressing Q or selecting the rectangular mask tool from the toolbar at the top. Draw a mask that encloses the word creative and the edge of the cube. Press M to reveal the mask properties, and set a keyframe for the mask position. Now, moving back to the second keyframe, double-click the mask and move it over again until it just covers the edge of the cube. Now we have the mask staying in position as the layer reveals itself. Now set the mask mode to subtract so that everything within the mask is excluded instead of shown. So now we'll move the block layer 10 frames down the timeline, and then move the time indicator another 5 frames down the timeline to set the final position keyframe for the layer. Now move back to the endpoint of the layer and move its position up until it just covers the bottom of creative. Similar to before, draw a mask to enclose the text and position its bottom edge so that it just barely covers up the word creative. Set the mask mode to subtract, press M to reveal the mask path, and set a keyframe. Then press U to reveal the animated properties and press K to go to the next revealed keyframe. Double-click the mask and reposition it again so that it stays in its original position. Now we have the block being revealed from the word creative. Alright, we're almost there. Now I'll move 5 more frames down the timeline and set a new keyframe for the position and Y rotation of the logo cube layer. Move 10 more frames down the timeline and move the layer to 740 on the x-axis. Change the Y rotation to -130. Next, select both type layers and press Option P to set new position keyframes. Move 10 frames down the timeline again, and move them so that they sit at the edge of the cube. Now scrubbing through, we reveal the text and have the logo cube roll into position. So, final touches. Back in the project window, select the form comp and drag it onto the Make New Comp button. Here, let's set a radial gradient. So with nothing selected in timeline, click on the rectangular mask tool, change the gradient type to radial, and then double-click on the rectangular mask. This will create a new shape layer with a radial gradient. Reposition the end of the gradient for a soft background, and then move the shape layer below the form comp so that we can see the particles. Clicking through the timeline shows the comp sits well in the background. To add just a hint of perspective, select the form layer and go to Effect, Perspective, Radial Shadow. Change the shadow opacity to 10 and the softness to 25. Finally, back in the form comp, select all the layers and press U to reveal all of the keyframe parameters. Drag a marquee to select all the keyframes and then press F9 to put an Easy Ease keyframe interpolation on everything. Alright, so we're really done. One more RAM preview of the final comp and I'll send you back to Aaron. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Carl. Great stuff. Okay, the good news and the bad news. Carl's family is about to double in size, so he's taking a break from the tutorial scene for a bit. But hey, don't worry. He's got tons of good stuff that you can find through his website at www.telescopemediagroup.net. There you'll find his blog, the company reel, and links to all of his tutorials. Again, thanks for the great work, Carl. Good luck, man. Sleep now while you can. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for RedGiantTV.com. See you next time.